All right, so kind of excited because we're making progress. Last week, we shifted our focus from what we've been looking at, which is the gospel in the Old Testament. So looking at these like pictures, patterns, hints of the gospel that are spread through the Old Testament in some really interesting ways. We've been looking at that. Now we're shifting to actually look at the gospel in the New Testament. And last week we talked about, so where do we find most obviously the gospel in the New Testament? What is the gospel? About? Jesus. Jesus is the gospel, right? He is the good news. Where do we find most directly information about Jesus? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? The Gospels. That's what we call the Gospels. I dove yesterday at hockey and cut. Turf burns. So we're looking at now we're going to be looking at these books, these Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which we call the Gospels. Last week, what we talked about is basically why do we have 4 Gospels? Why not just one Gospel, one story about Jesus? And we talked quite a bit about that. What are the 2 main reasons why we have multiple Gospels? Different perspectives, right? We talked about the fact that if only one person tells you about something, anything, and we talked about the getaway. You get Liam's a very bad example. Isaac to tell you what we did at the getaway. He'll tell you a whole bunch of stuff that we did at the getaway. He won't tell you a whole bunch of stuff that we did at the getaway. And the way that he tells you about the things that are at the getaway is going to be different to if I asked Amy to tell you about the getaway. Because they're going to remember different things. They're going to have seen things differently. They're going to have experienced things differently. And all that's going to come out in the way that they tell the stories, And so if you want to have a full picture of what we did at the getaway, you want to ask more than just Isaac or more than just Amy. The more people you ask, the fuller picture you're going to have, yeah? And that's one of the reasons why it's so helpful for us to have 4 versions of the gospel, of the story of Jesus. It's because we're not just getting what one person saw, what one person remembers. We're getting what 4 people saw and what 4 people remember. And so we get a much better picture. So that's the one reason. What's another reason?
We know it's true because 4 people saw the same bit.
Yeah, we talked about we talked about the idea that if you have only one person telling you something, there's no real way to know whether what they're telling you is true. Whether they're mistaken, whether they're lying, you don't know, because what are you going to compare it to? The fact that we have 4 different people telling us the story, if their stories are all basically telling you the same thing, then you can have a lot more confidence that what they're telling you is actually true. Because it's actually quite difficult to get 4 different people to all tell a very involved story and not contradict each other, and to not have all sorts of things that conflict. And that's what you do in a court of law. If you've got a witness, if we looked at God's law, he says you cannot convict anybody on one person's testimony. There has to be at least 2, ideally 3, so that you can question them, ask questions, see if their stories actually make sense. And that'll give you a better sense of whether what they're telling you is actually true. And so that's one of the other reasons why it's so helpful that we have 4 Gospels. It's because, it's not one person's testimony. It's not 2 or 3 people's testimony. God has essentially given us more than enough testimonies to know that the things that they're telling us are actually true. So that's what we looked at last week. And then we finished by saying, who wrote the Gospels? These testimonies that we're relying on.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
How do you know? It's their name on your book, but they didn't write their name anywhere in their book. All the Gospels are anonymous. They don't actually tell us who wrote them. And so, as we said, a lot of people today, particularly, and we'll talk about that later, a lot of people don't believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. They believe that the Gospels were actually written later, 100, 200, 300 years later, by Christians who wanted people to believe the things that they were telling them. And in order for people to take these stories seriously, they just put on these names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so that people would think that they were written by disciples and take them seriously. As we talked a little bit about that, some of the problems with that. One of the problems with that is if that's your goal and you're going to pick some names that you think will cause people to take your stories seriously, why would you pick Mark? Why would you pick Luke? Who were Mark and Luke? Were they disciples? Neither of them were disciples, and we'll look at that in a little bit. It doesn't really make sense to me. Pick Peter. Pick Andrew, pick Philip, pick Nathaniel, pick anybody who was actually there, right? Why would you pick Mark and Luke if you're just making this up? And then the other thing is that all the what are called early church fathers, so these are all the early Christian leaders in the church who wrote. They all said that the people who wrote these Gospels were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we looked at one of the examples of that, this guy called Irenaeus. Irenaeus was the disciple of somebody called Polycarp. She said it's a Pokemon, but it's also a leader of the church. And Polycarp was a disciple of John. So Polycarp literally was taught by, sat at the feet of the Apostle John, and then he taught Irenaeus. So not far removed, right? He spoke to the guy who spoke to John. And what Irenaeus says is that Matthew issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. And so some people believe that Matthew actually wrote his gospel in Hebrew originally, and it was then translated into Greek. While Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Peter and Paul, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him, and afterwards John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned against his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. And so Irenaeus, who's a disciple of Polycarp, who's a disciple of John, as well as all the other early church leaders, all said, these are the people who wrote the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then we said, two of those are eyewitnesses. Who are they?
Matthew and Luke. Matthew and John.
Matthew and John. Matthew and John are the two eyewitnesses. And so what we're going to do today is look at who these people were. And we're going to start with John. So, John was he had a brother. Does anybody know what John's brother's name was? James. James and John. They always go together. James and John were fishermen in a town called Capernaum. Capernaum, yep. I was looking up how you pronounce that this morning. So it was up here on the north coast of the Sea of Galilee. Oops, don't go forward or back. For perspective, there's Nazareth, there's Jerusalem. They were from up here, as well as Peter and Andrew. They were also fishermen in Capernaum. And John was one of the first people that Jesus called to be a disciple. And so John was an eyewitness. He was there for most of Jesus' ministry. And he actually says that in his letter towards the end of the Bible, in the letter of 1 John, he says, this is what we proclaim to you. Like, what we are telling you about is what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and our hands have touched concerning the word of life, and the life was revealed to us, and we have seen and testify and announced to you the eternal life that was with the Father and was revealed to us. And so he's telling you, when we're teaching you, the things that we're telling you, these are things that we actually heard with our own ears, that we saw with our own eyes. We touched him. So we're not making this up, you know? So that's John, an eyewitness. Then we have Matthew. Matthew was also from Capernaum, but he was not a fisherman. We think he was a Levite, from the tribe of Levi, which means that Matthew really should have been in the temple of God in Jerusalem serving God. But that's not where Jesus finds him. Finds him in a tax collector's booth, collecting taxes from his people. And so the chances are this Matthew would have been hated by pretty much all the Jews in Capernaum, probably including
his own family, like the son.
Perhaps his own family, perhaps James, John, Peter, and Andrew. He would not have been a popular guy because he was basically a traitor to his people. He was serving the Romans. But he'd probably have been quite wealthy and educated. And before the days of iPhones and recording devices, if you needed to record down in a meeting, for example, what was said, people had something called shorthand, which is kind of like just a code that they can write really, really fast and dictate, transcribe what people are saying, and then they can go back later and write it all out nicely in words. That was called shorthand, and there's a good chance that Matthew would have been quite good at shorthand because of his job and because of his education. And so we think he probably was able to transcribe most of Jesus' speeches word for word, which is, as you'll see as we go through the Gospels, Matthew has these long speeches of Jesus that often in Luke and Mark are condensed. And that might be partly why. So that's Matthew. Then we have Mark. As I said, Mark's not a disciple. He was not one of the 12, although it's possible that Mark did follow Jesus around a bit before he died. The reason we think that is there's this kind of funny story towards the end of Mark's gospel. He tells us there's this young man who followed Jesus to the Garden of Gethsemane when he was arrested. And after Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Mark writes this: "Then all the disciples left him and fled. A young man was following him, wearing only a linen cloth. They tried to arrest him, but he ran off naked, leaving his linen cloth behind." A lot of people think this young man was Mark, because Mark's the only person who writes about this, and it's kind of a strange and unnecessary detail to include. Why would you bother putting it in there? Well, it's a little bit it's, what do you call it? Like a humble brag or whatever, I was there, you know? I'm not saying I was there, but I was there, yeah. Anyway, so we don't know, but some people think this was Mark, was this young man who was following Jesus around. The first place that we actually see Mark named is in the book of Acts, in this amazing story. So Herod, who's king in Jerusalem under Roman authority, has had James, who was whose brother? John's brother James. He's had James arrested and executed. And then he arrests Peter. Now, after what's just happened to James, the believers are all terrified. No doubt Peter was terrified, because they knew what was likely to be what was going to happen to him. And so that night, all the believers in Jerusalem are praying and begging God to save Peter's life. And he does, in a pretty cool way. Peter is chained up in prison. There's guards outside the door. He's asleep. But next minute, this angel shows up, kicks him, "Wake up, get dressed, follow me." And he walks him out of the prison. And it says, as he comes to the gate of the prison, the gate literally just opens by itself and they walk out. Now, Peter thinks he must be dreaming. No wonder, right? So he assumes this is a dream until suddenly this angel disappears and he finds himself in the dark, in a street, all alone. And then it says, when he realized he's not dreaming, like this is actually real, you've just been walked out of prison, it says that he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who is also called Mark.
Wait, is Mary Mark?
There are lots of Marys. It was one of the most popular names in Israel at the time. No, Mary, not Jesus Mary. This is going to be a different Mary. Like I said, there were lots of Marys. Yeah. So Peter goes to Mary's house, and Mary is the mum of this person that's called John, but who's also called Mark. And basically, they had multiple names, and there's already a John in the story, right? Simon, Peter, yeah, like Simon, Peter. A lot of them had like multiple names, and often, in this case, as I say, there's already a John. If we start talking about John, everybody's going to get confused. So this John, you're like number 2. You get to be, we'll use your second name. We're not using you, you know? John's already taken. And so sometimes he's called John Mark. Other times he's just called straight Mark. He becomes known as Mark. And from this we know, and so it says that many people had gathered together and were praying. And so from this we know that Mark's family, at least, were believers. And they were quite tight with the disciples, because that's where Peter decided to go when he escaped from prison. And then the rest of that story is quite funny as well. Like he knocks on the door, and the young girl comes and like realizes it's Peter, and she doesn't open the door. She runs back to her family. She's like, "Peter's at the door," and they're like, "No, you're talking nonsense." And then he's like, "Let me in." Anyway, whatever. Okay. So that's Mark. Now Mark later joins up with his cousin Barnabas, and they join Paul on some of his missionary journeys. But apparently it was like all a bit much for this young guy, Mark. Maybe he got homesick or something, but at one point when they reach a place called Pamphylia, Mark abandons Paul and Barnabas, and he goes back to Jerusalem, back home, back to his mom. This makes Paul really angry. Basically he loses complete faith in Mark, because he's abandoned his mission, basically. And so later, when they want to go on another journey, and Barnabas wants Mark to come along, Paul's like, nah, he ditched us last time. He's not coming. And so then Barnabas and Mark end up traveling around and doing like missionary journeys together, and they go to a place called Cyprus. So that's Mark, but none of that is why Mark is the author of one of the Gospels of the Bible. Apparently, Mark was also very close to Peter. In Peter's first letter, at the end of the letter, he writes, "The church in Babylon, chosen together with you, greets you, and so does Mark, my son. Greet one another with a loving kiss. Peace to all of you who are in Christ." And so Babylon was, at the time that Peter's writing, Babylon was not a significant city, and there's no record that Peter ever went to Babylon. So we think he's actually referring to Rome, like metaphorically, as Babylon. Babylon was like figuratively like the source of all bad things in the Bible. And Rome at that time was like the equivalent of Babylon in ancient times. And so it's used it's used that way a little bit. And so they think that Peter is actually saying like the church in Rome, but he's speaking metaphorically. And we know that Peter did go to Rome because he died there. And apparently this Mark was with him. And Peter loved him like a son. Now, if you remember that quote that we looked at earlier from Irenaeus, he said that Mark was Peter's interpreter or translator. And that after Peter died, he wrote down all the things that he heard Peter teach. And all the early church fathers, that's like people you may not know, but Papyrus, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, they all say exactly the same thing, which is that Peter is the source of Mark's gospel. And so essentially this gospel of Mark is a second-hand eyewitness testimony of Peter's.
Why didn't Peter write it himself?
Don't know.
Can he not write?
Don't know. He was a fisherman, so he definitely wasn't like super educated. I don't know if he could write in Greek, which is what Mark wrote in. And I don't know, well, we'll get to that in a little bit. I don't know that he necessarily thought it was necessary.
Write it down.
He was going everywhere and telling everybody in person, and there were other people who were circulating written gospels. But anyway, we'll get there. So that's Mark. He's Peter's interpreter, translator, writing down the things that he heard Peter say. And he was super tight with Peter, loved like his son. Then we come to Luke. Luke is a bit different, built different. Like Mark, Luke is not a disciple. And in fact, Luke may not even have been Jewish. In Paul's letter to the Colossians, Paul writes, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. This part is kind of like back in Paul's good books. And Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends greetings. In terms of Jews, these are the only fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. Our dear friend Luke the physician and Demas greet you. And so what he's saying is that the only Jewish believers who are helping Paul at this stage are who?
Luke and Demas.
No.
Mark, Barnabas, and Aristarchus. The first three names.
And Justus. But it's Aristarchus, Mark, who's the cousin of Barnabas, and Jesus, who's called Justus. In terms of Jews, these are the only ones that are with me. Luke and Demas also send their greetings, which kind of implies that Luke and Demas are not Jewish. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so that's why we think that Luke actually was not Jewish, which, if that's true, is quite amazing, because Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke. He also wrote the book of Acts. And across those two books, that would make him the person who wrote more than any other person in the New Testament, depending on whether Paul wrote Hebrews, which we don't know because it doesn't say who wrote Hebrews. If Paul wrote Hebrews, then he wrote a little bit more than Luke. But basically, it's kind of amazing that this Gentile is like the majorest author in the New Testament. It's kind of cool. Yeah, and he also writes, as we'll see, the longest gospel. What's more, Luke is a physician. What does that mean? It's a doctor, not a physicist. Luke is a doctor, which again means he's educated. He was also apparently a brilliant historian and an excellent writer. I can't read ancient Greek, but I'm told that if you can read ancient Greek, then it's obvious that Luke knew what he was doing, that he was pretty skilled in writing in Greek. And he was also a faithful companion of Paul. He followed Paul around basically all over on all of his missionary journeys, and he stuck with Paul, apparently, even when everybody else abandoned him. And so that's Luke. But what is Luke doing writing the gospel? He's not a disciple. He was not an eyewitness of the things that Jesus did or the things that Jesus said. But he never claimed to be. This is how Luke starts his gospel. Many have undertaken to compile an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, like the accounts passed on to us by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning. So it seemed good to me as well, because I have followed all things carefully from the beginning, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know for certain the things you were taught. So that's how Luke's gospel begins. According to Luke, there are lots of people who have made it their job to provide written accounts of the things that they saw. Eyewitnesses. Probably includes Matthew, probably includes Mark, Peter via Mark. John, we think, was written quite a bit later. Their records are all their personal experiences, right? Their personal eyewitness testimonies. Luke has something different in mind for his gospel. There's a sentence in there that's like quite key to understanding his whole gospel, and it's translated differently in different versions of the Bible. In my Bible, it says that he has followed all things carefully from the beginning. It's a little bit ambiguous what that means. Does that mean that he actually was an eyewitness? That he saw all the things Jesus did and said from the beginning? Don't know. New King James is even weirder. New King James says he had perfect understanding of all things from the very first. What does that mean?
Well, he understood everything perfectly.
Apparently understood everything perfectly. That's quite a claim. This is the Greek that's being translated in different ways there. The first word, parakalotheo, that in here is translated followed, does literally mean to follow somebody. Like right next to them, right behind them. Literally. But what does that allow you to do if you're like right next to them everywhere they go? Know a lot about them, right? You get to learn a lot about them. And that was the model of discipleship in ancient Israel. You were, by being chosen as a disciple, you were being chosen to learn from your rabbi, from your teacher. But you didn't learn by like sitting behind desks or on these chairs and listening to him teach. The way you learned as a disciple was you literally followed your rabbi everywhere they went. So you heard everything they said. You saw everything they did. You followed them. Initially, literally, but hopefully, eventually, you would begin to follow them figuratively, metaphorically. You start to act like them. And that was the model of discipleship, of learning in ancient Israel. And so this word parakalotheo literally means to follow someone, but figuratively it's a word that can also be used to mean to like study or investigate, to get to know something really well. Yeah? Okay. So he was investigating, he was investigating what? The word is pas, and it literally means everything, all things. Beginning with what? This word, anothen, the very, very first thing. Okay? So he investigated everything from the first thing. And how did he do it? Yeah, akrobos. It's actually a really cool word. It comes from a word, akron, that is literally the very furthest end of something. So New Zealand would be the akron of the earth. The very furthest end of the earth would be the idea. And when it comes to studying something, understanding something, it means that you're studying it really, really precisely, diligently, thoroughly. We would say to the nth degree, to the very end. And so that's really what Paul is saying here, is that he is not wanting to give he's not wanting to give his own subjective, personal testimony. What he's wanting to provide is a complete and carefully organized, well-researched record of Jesus' life. He wants to approach the story of Jesus, the gospel, as a historian. He wasn't there when Jesus was born. He wasn't there when John the Baptist was conceived. So how would he know what happened?
Carefully research.
What would that look like? How would you find out?
Talk to them.
Yeah, you go talk to them, right? Chances are Luke would have gone and spoken to Mary. And he would have gone and spoken to maybe Elizabeth, who we'll look at next week. The disciples for sure, right? He went and collected their testimonies. He investigated the things that they said carefully. And then he put it together into this, as I say, careful, thorough. He gives us the most complete and comprehensive gospel that we have, is Luke. As we'll see next week, he begins his gospel earlier than any of the other disciples do. And he follows his gospels right through to Jesus' ascension to heaven and actually kind of even beyond that, because he writes the book of Acts, which tells us what happened after that. So he was pretty thorough. And as I say, he's regarded widely as one of the best historians that we have in ancient times. And so personally, I'm really glad that it seemed good to Luke to provide this orderly account. Late night concerts. Okay, now before we finish with these first four verses, Paul is writing this account for somebody called Theophilus. So who is Theophilus? Well, his name is made up of two Greek words, theos and philos. Theos is the word for God, and philos is a friend. And so Theophilus' name literally means friend of God. It's a pretty cool name. So some people think, maybe he's just writing to believers. And he's just giving them this pseudonym, Theophilus. But really he's just writing to people who are friends of God. Maybe. However, he addresses Theophilus with a title. He calls him Most Excellent Theophilus. And in the book of Acts, Paul uses the same title to refer to two people, Felix and Festus, who are both Roman officials in the Roman Empire. And so one possibility is that this Theophilus is actually an important person in the Roman government. In fact, some people think that the letter of Luke and the book of Acts were written as in preparation for Paul's trial before Caesar. Because he's on trial for the things that he's been doing and the things that he's been teaching. And so and Luke was with him. And so some people think that he was writing these accounts as a record of this is how I ended up here, And so it's possible that Theophilus was a Roman official who was somehow involved in Paul's trials. We don't know. The other possibility is that at about this time, there was a priest in Jerusalem, the high priest of Jerusalem was called Theophilus ben Ananias. And so it's possible that he's writing to the high priest in Jerusalem. And there are some things that might suggest that. For example, Luke starts his gospel with the story of another priest. And when it comes to Jesus' trials, Luke doesn't include Caiaphas' role. He doesn't talk about Caiaphas, who was high priest. But Caiaphas was also Theophilus ben Ananias' brother-in-law. And so maybe that's why Luke kind of ignores that little bit of the story. Don't know. What we do know is that this Theophilus apparently had heard things about Jesus. He'd been taught certain things, and on the back of Paul's gospel that he's written, he can now know those things are true for certain. And that's the point of his gospel. And with that, we've finished the first 4 verses of the book of Luke. We've started. Now I've put this together on the right here, and we're going to use that to keep track of what we've looked at in the Gospels, because we're going to be looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all at the same time, different parts at different times, and so we're going to slowly fill it in. We've now finished the first 4 verses of the book of Luke. By the time we finish, they should all be read. Read, that's kind of funny, that's a pun. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. We are done the first 4 verses. Now, there's one more thing I want to look at before we go on to the rest of we go on with Luke's story, with his record. As I said at the start, and as we said last week, there are many biblical scholars, and by that I mean people who study the Bible, but not necessarily people who believe the Bible. There are a lot of people like that. It's a historical document that's had a very big impact in our society. And so there are non-Christians, secular people who see value and interest in studying the Bible, but not as people who actually believe what it says. And as I said, many of them do not believe that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written by eyewitnesses who were actually there at the time of Jesus, or that they were written shortly after Jesus. They believe that Jesus is a real person in history because he's spoken about in history, not just in the Bibles. There's actually a whole bunch of places where early Roman and other Greek Jewish historians write about this guy who is in Jerusalem and a whole bunch of things about him. One example is a Jewish historian called Josephus, and he wrote something called the Antiquities of the Jews. It's basically the history of the Jewish people. It's this huge encyclopedia that he put together. And he writes this. This is taken from an Arabic version of, anyway, it doesn't matter, but it's from a particular version of his. Basically, he wrote in Greek, but the people who looked after his writings that allowed them to survive were mostly Christians. And so people who want to criticize it basically say that Christians must have written some stuff in there to make their faith sound better, in Josephus's words, but it wasn't actually what Josephus wrote. But this is taken from a different version of his text, which actually is like less like glorifying of Jesus anyway. So this is what Josephus writes. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. And so this is what Josephus wrote in about 94 AD. So like about, 60 years after Jesus died. It's pretty early. So it's hard to deny that Jesus was a real person who really lived and really did most of the things. Well, let's not say most of the things, there's not that much information, but it's clear that he was alive, that he was considered a good person, that he did what appeared to be miracles, that he died, and people claim to see him rise from the dead. There's even ancient records of the eclipse, like the darkness in Jerusalem, that are not associated with Jesus, but written by Greek and Roman historians. So anyway, there's all this information about Jesus that we know that's not from the Bible. And so anyway, these biblical scholars, they believe that Jesus was a real person, but they don't believe that he performed miracles. They don't believe that he claimed to be the Son of God. And they certainly don't believe that he rose from the dead. They believe that these are ideas that Christians came up with later, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years after Jesus, and then worked into these Gospels that they wrote at that time. Now, the fact is, the earliest complete New Testament that we have comes from about 350 AD. So that's about 300 years after Jesus. I should have put it in there. The earliest manuscripts that we have, fragments of manuscripts that we have of the Gospels in particular, come from around about 100, 150 AD. Jesus died around about 32, 33 AD. So the question is, if the Gospels are authentic, they were actually written by people who were around at the time of Jesus in 32, 33 AD, why do we not have any copies of their writing until 100 years later? You know? That's what causes, or at least it's an excuse that a lot of people use to say they're not real. They weren't actually written by those people. Which is one possibility. The reason we don't have Gospels here, and it's the only possibility if you don't want to believe that Jesus is the person that the Gospels say that he is. You have to believe, well, they're not authentic. They can't be real eyewitnesses. They're written later. It's a whole area of study that I don't want to get too deep into today, but what was I going to say? As we said already, there are other reasons that, to me, that theory doesn't really hold up very well. And one of those is the fact that all of the early church fathers say they're the ones who wrote it, as well as the fact is why would you choose those names and that kind of stuff. The other possibility, the reason why we don't have any manuscripts before 150 AD, is that I actually don't think it's that complicated. They wrote their Gospels on papyrus paper, which was a paper made out of reeds. And the fact is, papyrus paper doesn't last that long, particularly not if you're actually using it, if you're actually reading it. It would have been great if somebody round about here, say, had thought, in 2,000 years' time, there are going to be some academics who are going to be wondering, are these things authentic? Are they real? And so they had taken some of the first copies of Matthew's Gospel and they'd carefully stored them in a sealed jar in a dry cave, and nobody opened it for 1,500 years. That would be great, right? Then we would have copies of those Gospels from really, really early on. But I don't think that was something that was a concern for the people in, say, 40 AD, when these Gospels are being written. I don't think they didn't think we'd still be here in 2,000 years. You know? They all thought Jesus was coming back at any moment, because he said he was going to, right? They certainly thought he was going to come back within their lifetime. There's one of Paul's letters where he's writing to a church, and they're all freaking out because people are dying and Jesus hasn't come back yet. Where is he? Have they been lost? Are they not going to be saved? You know, because they all thought Jesus was coming back in their lifetime. And so they weren't worried about what people were going to think in 2,000 years' time. Their concern was about spreading the gospel as quickly as possible to as many people as possible. And so they're not going to waste a valuable, it's not easy making a copy. You don't just stick it through the copy machine, to make a copy of Matthew's Gospel. Somebody has to sit there and copy it letter by letter. They're valuable. They're not going to put it in a jar. They're going to use every single copy there is to spread the gospel as fast as possible. You know what I mean? Now, have any of you guys seen a Bible that belongs to somebody who reads it and has been reading it for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? Is it in good condition? No, they don't last that long, right? They fall apart. That's exactly what happened, I believe, to Matthew, Mark, Luke's Gospels. They were being spread all over the Roman Empire, church to church. Read this, you have to read this. Everybody's reading. They're going to fall apart. And it wasn't until much later that people decided we need to actually start looking after these things, right? And there's enough copies of them, and Jesus hasn't come back yet, that we can actually start thinking about these things. So, that I think is the answer of why we don't have Gospels, copies, manuscripts from these early years, why they only come up later. But that still raises the question, if the copies that we have are from 100 years later, how do we know that they're reliable? How do we know that there weren't errors made when they were copying them? Because we haven't got the original Gospels. All we have is copies and copies of copies of the original Gospels. Again, don't want to get too distracted, but I do want to touch on it very briefly, because the first thing that you should know is the scribes did make mistakes. Lots of mistakes. Some scribes added things to the Gospels. Other scribes removed things from the Gospels. And we, for the most part, don't know who the scribes were. We don't know why they were making these copies, and we don't know whether they had good reasons or bad reasons for adding and taking things away. Most of the differences, most of the mistakes are just very basic spelling, grammar mistakes. But there are actually some significant differences amongst some of the manuscripts that we have. Thankfully, it doesn't really matter, yeah?
Doesn't say in Revelation, if anyone adds or takes away.
Yeah.
The words, it's wrath of God.
Correct. But all we have now is this manuscript. We don't know where it came from. We don't know who was writing it. It might have been somebody who didn't believe in Jesus, who was trying to mess things around, We don't know. But as I said, thankfully, it doesn't actually matter. I was shown this illustration that I think is really helpful. So imagine I'm going to send a message out to Fusion Youth on Instagram. I say, remember to come to youth on Friday at 7:30 p.m. We'll sing some worship. Georgia will share her testimony, and there might be some cake.
Is there anything?
There might be, but there won't be. Okay, how confident are you that this message is correct? That there are no mistakes in it? 100% confident. How do you know? There's no follow-up.
Yeah, and also
It looks grammatically correct. Okay, yeah, there's no grammatical errors. It makes sense.
But like, you starts at 6:30.
Maybe we're starting later this week. But also, you don't know, right? That could be a mistake. Maybe it's supposed to be 8 o'clock. Maybe it's supposed to be 6 o'clock. Maybe it's actually Jan sharing her testimony. Although she already did. Could be somebody else, right? There's no real way of knowing. You just have to assume that it makes sense, it must be true. Okay. Different situation. I send a message. It says, remember to come to Booth on Friday at 6:30 p.m. We'll ping some worship. Jeff will share her testimony, and there might be cake. Okay, you're laughing because there are some mistakes in there, yeah? Okay, yeah, it's annoying because autocorrect does these things. So I'm like, okay, try again, write it again. Register to come to youth on Friday at 6:30 p.m. We'll sing some flagship. Georgia will play her testimony, and there might be cake. More mistakes. Oh no. Okay, so I'll try again. Remember to come to youth on Friday at 7:30 p.m. We'll sing some worship. Georgia will share her friendship, and there might be cake. Ugh. Remember to camp at youth on Friday at 6:30 p.m. We'll sing some worship. Georgia will share his testimony, and there might be bake. One more time. Remember to come to youth on Thursday at 6:30 p.m. We'll sing no worship. Georgia will share her testimony, and there might be cake XO. We have 5 different messages here, right? They're all got mistakes in them. Obviously. Do you know what that message should say? Can you figure it out? How? What? How?
Does it say, remember to come to youth on Friday, 6:30. Sing worship. And Georgia will share a testimony. And there might be cake.
Yeah. By comparing these messages to each other, you can actually see where the errors are, right? You can figure out the things that aren't consistent, and you can also see all the things that are consistent. And by doing that, you can put a message together. You can reconstruct what the message should have said. Remember to come to youth on Friday at 6:30 p.m. We'll sing some worship. Georgia will share her testimony, and there might be cake.
So that's what happened with all these.
Correct. But here's the question. Which of these 2 messages can you be more confident in? That you know it's right? This
Those two.
out of these 2. Why? Because you think that's the right answer.
Yeah.
Okay, but you're bringing in other information. Just what you have.
Is that you've compared all of these ones on the side and you've cross-referenced them and you've created one that best fits all of the information that's there.
You have all these messages to compare. What's the chance that I got it wrong in all these messages, right? Versus what's the chance that I got it wrong in one message? You've got nothing to compare this to, so there's no way of knowing whether it's true. Whereas this, you can actually have a lot more information to confirm what's true and what isn't. That is exactly the situation we have with the Bible. Except we don't have 5 versions to compare. There are somewhere close to 6,000 partial or complete copies of the New Testament books in Greek. There are another 10,000 translated into Latin, and there are almost another 10,000 in various other ancient languages, Arabic and that kind of thing. We have close to well over 25,000 manuscripts that we can do this with. And we can find the places that are different, that we think are errors, And we can then find all the places that aren't different, that we can actually have a lot of confidence in. And so we can actually reconstruct the original Gospels to an amazing degree of accuracy, even if every single one of the versions of the Gospels that we have errors in them. Does that make sense? Now, with that said, there are some lines in the New Testament that we're not completely sure whether they should be there or not. My understanding is it's about 40 in the New Testament. That after doing this analysis, we don't know whether they should be there or not, which sucks. But what about the other 8,000 verses? The other 8,000 are basically identical across 25,000 copies. And so, while it sucks that there are some verses in the Bible, in the New Testament, that we're not completely sure about, they have no influence on our understanding of the gospel. They don't affect our theology at all. But the fact that there are differences between the manuscripts allows us to be way more confident on the verses that are the same than we could be if we only had one copy that there was nothing to compare it to, you know? And as I said, it's the number of verses that we're not sure about are completely insignificant compared to the 8,000 verses that we can be completely sure about.
What are those 40 verses? And all of them in the Gospels?
No, not all of them in the Gospels. We'll look at some of them as we go. Yeah. Okay, last thing that I want to look at before we finish. As I said, I'm completely convinced that the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses, that they're written by the people that we understand that says that they're written, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I'm convinced that the Gospels that we have are close to identical to what their original Gospels were because of this type of thing. The final question is, when did they write them? Jesus died around about 33 AD. About 35 years later was one of the most significant events in almost all of Jewish history. One of the most traumatic events this side of 0 AD, probably on par with the Holocaust. And that was when the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem. 5 months. That was absolutely brutal. Eventually the siege, they broke in. There was apparently a massacre of about 1 million people. And then they completely destroyed Jerusalem, completely destroyed the temple, and exiled the Jews out of Israel. That happened in 70 AD. That event is not mentioned anywhere in the New Testament. It's not mentioned by any of the gospel writers, and it's not mentioned by it's not even hinted at in any of the letters that were written by Paul or anybody else. That's despite the fact that Jesus prophesied that this would happen, which we'll look at when we get there. So you would think, if it seems impossible to me that nobody would think or would want to say in their letters, by the way, this is what Jesus said would happen, you know? Yeah, so for me, I'm quite sure that the Gospels were written before 70 AD. But that's not the only major event in early church history that isn't included in the Gospels. We know that James, John's brother, was executed in Jerusalem. It's recorded in the book of Acts. That happened in about 44 AD. But he's not the only martyr in the early church. Peter was martyred in Rome. And we believe that happened around about 64 to 67 AD. That's not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. Paul was executed, beheaded in Rome at about the same time. Before that, James, who was Jesus' half-brother and who became the leader of the church in Jerusalem, he was martyred in Jerusalem, thrown off the temple apparently, and then beaten to death in around 62 AD. None of these deaths are recorded in anywhere in the Bible. Certainly not in the book of Acts. Acts ends before any of this happens. And so that tells me that the book of Acts was written sometime before probably 60 AD. The introduction to the book of Acts, Luke says that the book of Acts is basically a sequel to his previous book, book of Luke, which means the book of Luke had to have been written before the book of Acts. And the book of Luke, in its introduction, Luke says, there are other people who've already written eyewitness accounts, which I'm pretty sure would be Matthew and Mark. And so Matthew and Mark's Gospels, I believe, would have been written even before Luke's. Which means that these Gospels were written within 30 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. To put that into some context, if the Gospels were written today about something that happened about 30 years ago, that's like, what's that, 90s, mid-90s. I would have been a teenager when Jesus died. The disciples would probably be around about the age of your parents. And they're writing about something that they saw, something that they did in their 20s, and that they've been telling everybody about for the last 20 to 30 years. And so to me, I have no concern about the reliability of the testimonies we have in these gospel books, in our Bibles. I'm convinced that they were written by eyewitnesses or by the people that said that they were. And I'm convinced that they are reliable records of the things that Jesus did and the things that Jesus said. And as we go on, as we actually start to look at the Gospels, we'll find some other quite cool evidences of that. Cool. All right, let's pray. Lord God, I thank you again so much for your word, and I thank you so much for these written records, Lord, that we haven't had to rely on, oral tradition being handed down for 2,000 years and trusting that it's something like what actually happened in the beginning, Lord. I thank you that you've given us these Gospels, and particularly with Luke, this carefully, thoroughly researched, ordered account of your life, and for the confidence that can give us as we just place our whole lives in your hands. And I pray that you would continue to strengthen our faith and continue to reveal yourself to us, Lord, in real ways. I pray that you'd be with everybody here this week and that you bring us back again safely next week. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.